All right, good. Welcome, Irene. Good to see you. Okay, so welcome, everyone. Welcome to those who are here live, and welcome to those who are tuning in to this recording post hoc. You are all most welcome. If you'll allow me, I will share my screen. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Hopefully. Good.
Yes.
Excellent. So because it's a reasonably small group, let's just say that we'll take a more informal and relaxed approach to this workshop today. So if you have any questions as I go along, just interrupt me. You don't need to raise your hand because I won't be able to see it in this mode anyway. So just feel free to interrupt me. I won't consider it rude at all. So this is the 7th paper development workshop of this year, with 1 through 6 looking at how to write your paper, and this workshop looking at how to revise your paper once you've submitted it and gotten a decision back from the reviewers and the editor. I am Andrew Timming. I'm a professor of human resource management at RMIT University, and I'm also the Deputy Dean Research and Innovation in the School of Management. Okay, so first I would say to those of you who've been following this series from 1 to 7, and as you've been following this series, you've been writing a paper, I would say congratulations. You've written an academic paper, and that's an awesome feat. That's no easy feat. It's not something that you can just do in a couple days. As we all know, writing papers takes months. Sometimes writing papers takes years. I have a colleague in the UK, a friend of mine, who just got her paper published in Journal of Management Studies, and she said it took her 11 years. Yes, 11 years. Lots of rejections along the way, lots of revising and resubmitting, but in the end, it did find a home. It found a very good home. So it is a very difficult task to write a paper, and I think it's something that we should commend, right? In academia, I think we need to celebrate every victory, no matter how small that victory is. Even if it's just writing a paper, you haven't even gotten it published, maybe you haven't even submitted it yet, but you should celebrate the fact that you've actually written a paper from top to bottom. That in and of itself, I think, is worth, you know, an evening at the beach, or treating yourself to a nice dinner or something like that. So you've struggled through the different sections that we've talked about. You've struggled through writing the introduction, where you introduce your topic and you explain why your topic is important, and you briefly show how you make a contribution to the extant literature. You've written your literature review or your theory sections, where you've critically examined what other scholars have said about this particular topic of yours, and you've identified potential gaps in what other people have said, and you've showed how your particular contribution says something new, or says something original, or says something exciting about the topic. You've articulated your research methods. We looked at both qualitative and quantitative methods throughout this workshop series. You've reported your results. Again, we bifurcated that workshop into both qualitative and quantitative results. And you've wrapped up with a good discussion where you really hit home your contribution to the literature. You talk about your theoretical contributions, your practical or practitioner contributions or implications, and you talk about the limitations and directions for future research associated with your paper. So now what? Right, here we are. What are we going to do now? First question on your mind when you finish a paper is, where do I submit this manuscript? Now, some researchers write with a particular journal in mind, and other researchers will wait until they see the finished product before deciding. And I sort of put in quotations here that this isn't exactly an either or process. Personally, I would advise against not thinking in advance about the type of journal that you want to submit to. It's good to be flexible. So if you have a particular journal in mind, and then you get to the end of your paper and you realize that maybe in retrospect it's not the best fit, that's fine, that's okay. But it is a good idea to think before you write about the type of audience that you're seeking to attract. And I think that is actually a nice segue to the last point on this slide, which is knowing the ethos of the journal to which you intend to submit. So before you submit a paper to a journal, it's a good idea to read some recent volumes. Maybe not all of it, but at least have a look at the types of papers that have been published in the last couple years, so you can get a feel for the debates and the controversies and the theories that are being tested and explored in the journal more recently. And by getting a sense of those debates, then you can make sure that your paper aligns, again, makes a contribution to those debates and says something new about them. I think in my experience, when papers get rejected these days, it's often because the authors don't understand the ethos of the journal. So it is important to get a sense for what is published in a particular journal and whether or not what you're saying adds something to that discussion. As a general rule of thumb, if you get to the end of a paper and you find you're not sure where to submit, right? Maybe you had a particular journal in mind, but then you've gotten to the end of it, you've written it, and you're thinking to yourself, well, maybe not, maybe that journal might not be the best option. As a general rule of thumb, I just go to my reference page and I look through my reference page and I look at the different journals that I've cited along the way, because that's a pretty good indication of types of journals that might be receptive to your particular product, to what you've written. Generally speaking, I would say it is inadvisable to submit a paper to a journal unless you have cited that journal somewhere in your reference page. I know that seems a bit silly, to tell you the truth. It's not clear why we would have to insert a citation of the journal to which we're submitting, especially if it's you're seeking that out. It didn't fit very well in terms of what you were saying, and you're having to look for potential papers that could be brought into it. But, you know, let's face it, editors often look at these things. You know, they'll look at the reference page and say, are they citing us? Are they aware of what we're doing? So yeah, generally speaking, it's a good idea to look through your reference page and potentially pick a journal to submit based on who you've cited. Okay. Oh no, you've been desk rejected. Happens all the time. Happens to me all the time. Happens to, you know, full professors all the time. Happens to lecturers all the time. This is just the nature of the game. We cannot escape a desk rejection. Sometimes it's a bit painful to read those letters from the editor. It's less painful if you submit and you get a desk rejection within 2 days. It's considerably more painful when you submit and you get a desk rejection a month or 2 or 3 months later, right? That is a painful, a hard pill to swallow when that happens. But what I want to emphasize to you in this presentation is that although a desk rejection can be painful, it's actually often a blessing in disguise, and I'll explain to you why I think it's a blessing in disguise. The editor's read the paper and he or she thinks it doesn't have legs, then there's no real purpose in progressing it, right? If the editor sends it off for review and it comes back, as most reviews do, maybe with one person recommending reject and two recommending major revisions, or maybe even all recommending major revisions, or some different configuration, it's not likely that the paper will progress anyway. The editor has pretty much already made up his or her mind, and by sending the paper out for review, that's adding an extra 3 to 6 months, maybe even sometimes up to a year, sometimes even longer, to the process. So you need to bear in mind that when an editor desk rejects you, it's actually a favor because it's speeding up the process. It's not wasting your time. It's recognizing that you now have an opportunity to move on to the next journal rather than to send a paper out that really doesn't have much chance of success anyway and will more likely than not end up in rejection after peer review. So I think, staying sane in academia is often about changing your gut reaction to different events that happen to you. And desk rejections are one of those events that can be very demoralizing. I remember as an early career researcher just feeling distraught every time I got a desk reject. But over time, I've come to appreciate that a desk reject just saved me a bunch of time, and then I can move on to the next outlet. And I would urge you to do the same. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, in my experience, and I say my experience as an editor and an author, I've been rejected as an author countless number of times, and I, as an editor, have rejected countless number of papers at desk level. In my experience, these desk rejects are more often due to a lack of fit than anything. Generally speaking, the empirical and theoretical quality of papers is pretty good these days. Uh, Authors who haven't put together very good papers don't end up submitting them anyway because they already know what the decision is going to be. So there's not a lot of, I wouldn't say there isn't a huge amount of poorly designed papers that go through at least journals like mine, Human Resource Management Journal. The ones that we get are usually methodologically pretty sound and theoretically pretty sound. Maybe there are ways that you can improve them, of course, but they're generally speaking pretty good. And it's pretty rare that a paper would get rejected simply based on the fact that it is in poor condition. Much more common is the fact that we reject a paper based on fit. And this is why I say, know the ethos of your journal. Go through and read some of the articles that have been published previously and try and engage in those debates, because it will dramatically increase at least the chances of your paper entering the peer review process, right? No guarantee, obviously, but it will certainly put you in good stead if you're attempting to engage in the ethos of the journal. Sometimes I think this goes a little bit too far. For better or for worse, I would say probably for worse. I've noticed a trend recently in HRM journals where I tend to publish, where papers are getting rejected because editors are saying this isn't HRM, this is OB. Now, I understand there's a difference between those fields, but there's also a lot of overlap. And I think that editors sometimes go too far in saying, well, this isn't within the scope of what our journal's about. I think editors would do better to widen their scope and appreciate, a greater degree of heterogeneity in theoretical approaches and in methodological approaches. But that's neither here nor there. I mean, that's just the way academia has evolved. Last point I want to make here is that when you do get a desk reject and the editor makes some suggestions to you, I would urge you to pay very, very close attention to those comments. Okay. And the reason is that these are probably the best, most valuable comments you will ever receive from anyone. Right. So let me explain why. When you send a paper to a reviewer, they are going to spend a lot of time dissecting the paper and looking for problems and issues associated with it. Even if those problems and issues are pretty minor, they're going to want to put them in there because they want to feel like they're doing a thorough job. Now, an editor doesn't have that kind of time. When I read through a paper and I decide to desk reject it, when I sit down to write my letter, I'm literally going to focus on just the very core issues with this manuscript. I don't care about the minor things; those don't really matter to me. I'm not going to take the time to write out my concerns with minor issues with your paper. I'm going to say, look, these are the 3 or 4 major problems with this paper that if you were to address them, it would dramatically improve how it would be received. So when you get a desk reject, don't just throw it away. Sit on it, think about it, work on it, particularly the issues that the editor has articulated, and I guarantee you your chances of success at the next round will go up. Okay. All right, so you submitted your paper and now you have the highly coveted revise and resubmit. Now, revise and resubmit is a good thing. I've noticed increasingly revise and resubmits over the last couple of years have been referred to as reject and resubmits. I'm not sure why editors are doing that other than potentially to shatter our confidence even more than it has been shattered as a result of our choice of going into this particular career. Either way, whether you call it a revise and resubmit or reject and resubmit, it's the same thing. You get an opportunity to resubmit, but reject really makes you feel much smaller than a revise and resubmit. So perhaps that's why they do it. I've also noticed, again, over the last maybe 5 years or so, a quite dramatic increase in what editors are calling a high risk resubmission, right? They didn't use that terminology when I started in academia, whatever it was, 12 or 13 years ago. A high risk revise and resubmit is the editor telling you that you better do a good job with your revise and resubmit, or else it's not going to go through. It's likely that I might reject it. I wouldn't worry too much about the terminology, whether it's reject and resubmit or high risk revise and resubmit. Just do the best job that you can. In fact, just 3 days ago, I got a response from an editor. So we initially submitted the paper. We got one of these high risk revise and resubmit, said there's no guarantee that this will go through even if you make the revisions. So we did it, submitted it, and then 3 days ago we got the response back. It went from a high risk revise and resubmit to minor revisions. So it didn't seem that high risk after all. So don't worry about the terminology that editors use. Instead, focus on just doing the best job you can with your revision. As you know, the process is something along the lines of an editor reviewing a paper, commissioning 2 to 3, sometimes up to 6. I've actually heard even more. The most I've ever had is 5 or 6. Maybe I have had 6 reviewers. This is often not intentional. This is a symptom of the fact that as editors, it's hard for us to get reviewers. And so in the first instance, we invite maybe 10 or 12, just assuming that a number of them are going to either not respond to our request or reject our request to review your paper. But then on occasion, maybe 6 or 4 or 5 of them will say yes. In that case, unfortunately, you end up with 5 or 6 reviews. But generally speaking, it's 2 to 3, and then the editor will make a decision on the basis of those reviews. So let's assume that you have written your paper, you have submitted your paper, it has not been desk rejected, which is great, and you've just gotten your decision letter. And the decision letter says, it won't say congratulations, but it'll say, thank you very much for your submission. Typically, we've decided to give you major revisions, and here's what you need to do. And typically you'll have some comments from the editor at the top, and then you'll have your reviewer comments below in the letter. Now you'll notice on this particular slide, one of the bullet points is in very large letters relative to the others. And the reason that it is in very large letters is that I want to accentuate how absolutely crucial and important this point is, because it can be a real point of contention among co-authors. Obviously, this is irrelevant if you're doing a single authored paper, right? But most papers are co-authored. And when you get a revise and resubmit, the first thing you need to do, well, maybe we'll go to the second point. For the first thing you need to do is sleep on it, right? Have a think before you start responding. Don't just start to, jump into action straight away. It's possible after 24 hours of thinking about it, you might be able to see the letter in a different light, right? But the next point, and this is the most crucial one, the first bullet point on this slide, is to work out a plan in advance with your co-authors. Because I've seen this happen so many times before, especially when there's a large number of co-authors. If you have 5 or 6 authors, it's a classic free writing problem, right? There's probably some economist out there who's done a paper on this, particularly, mathematically modeling these dynamics. No one wants to do the work, but everyone wants to get the publication. And so if there's no explicit division of labor in terms of who's supposed to do what and by when for your revise and resubmit, then generally speaking, this will go down to the wire. And then at the last second, the most committed co-author will do most of the work. And I'm speaking from personal experience, in fact, fairly recent experience with one of my papers, which is maybe why I put it in bold here. And you'll never guess who the most committed person was on the paper. Well, maybe you will guess. It was me. And that was my fault. Well, I don't know if it was my fault. I think it was my fault. I'm the lead author of the paper, and I should have, at the beginning of that process, the minute we got that revise and resubmit, said, all right, you do this, finish up by that, you take those issues, finish up by that, and you take this, and you do that. Instead, no one wanted to touch it. Everyone was waiting for someone else to do it. And in the end, I pretty much had to do it all. So work out that plan in advance. Don't just let it sit and hope that somehow organically everyone will just jump on and start to work on it, because that's not very realistic. Now, let's move on to the practicalities of responding to a revise and resubmit. As you know, it's not just the changes you make to the manuscript itself, but you also have to include what editors call an author's note or a response letter. And this author's note and response letter will then accompany your revised paper when you resubmit it, right? So once you've articulated a plan in terms of who's doing what and by when, and you've thought about how to tackle these particular comments, the next step for you to do before you begin to make the revisions is to create a skeleton or an outline of your response letter, of your author's note. So what I've done on the next slide is just given you an example, just a short example of what my author's notes tend to look like. You obviously don't have to do it this way, but you're welcome to replicate this template. So here we go. Author's note, response letter template. Dear, and then put the name of the editor. I usually start by being profusely grateful for the time and the attention to detail that the editor and the reviewers have put into our manuscript. So I would start by saying something along the lines of, thank you very much for the opportunity to revise and resubmit our paper. We're most grateful for the time and the attention that you and the reviewers have given to our manuscript. As a result of your insight and suggestions, the paper is now dramatically improved. There should be a D at the end of improved there. In what follows, we report your comments and the actions we took to address them, right? So then the way I structure these is I have comment 1, action 1, comment 2, action 2, comment 3, action 3. And I'll break these up into different subsections. So the first set of comments will be the editor's comments, right? I'll have a little heading that says editor's comments, and then I'll have comment 1, action 1, comment 2, action 2, comment 3, action 3. And then it'll be reviewer 1 comments as a header, and then comment 1, action 1, comment 2, action 2, etc. Reviewer 2, reviewer 3. So essentially what I'm doing here is I'm copying and pasting what the reviewers and the editors have said about my paper into the comment 1 section. And then I add the text in action 1, where I'm actually responding to or showing how I'm responding to that particular comment. Here's a good a hot tip for maybe an early career researcher out there who hasn't submitted a paper yet. I frequently see this as a rookie mistake. It seems sensible to want to create a table to do this, right? So you create a table with different rows and columns, and you have comment 1 on the left and action 1 on the right, or response on the right. You'll find that when you resubmit your paper, especially if it's done through Manuscript Central, it won't be able to cope with your table formatting. So you will have wasted all that time creating a nice clean table, and then you'll find that you have to get rid of it all anyway at the last second before you submit and put it in this kind of format. So comment 1, action 1. I used to call it problem 1, action 1, problem 2, action 2, but I sort of determined that you don't want to over accentuate that what you've done is a problem. So I've since used the word comment rather than problem. So this is how I structure my response letters. I, again, am sort of profusely thankful to the reviewer and the reviewers and the editors throughout. But the important point here is that you're structuring it in a way that's clear and easy for the reviewer and the editor to read. Okay, I often get this question. Do I have to address every single comment that is made in by the reviewers and by the editors? The answer to this question is yes and no. How can it be yes and no? Well, let me explain. If a reviewer suggests that you do something that makes no sense, and believe me, that happens more than it should. If a reviewer suggests something that makes no sense, you can't simply ignore it. As much as you'd like to, it doesn't make sense to just ignore it because it's going to agitate the reviewer and possibly even the editor. So if a reviewer suggests something that makes sense, You need to respond to that suggestion. You probably won't say, this doesn't make sense, but you can say something kind and something face-saving along the lines of, many thanks for this really interesting idea. I can see why you would think that this is important for us to consider. However, the scope of this particular paper does not enable us, as a result of word limitations, to move in this direction, but we will definitely consider it for our next paper, right? So you're sort of saying, nah, I'm not going to do that. But you're not saying, no, I'm not going to do that. You're saying, I'm not going to do that in a way that is much more palatable for the reviewer and the editor. So it's recognizing that that's an interesting suggestion, even if it's not, but you still have to say it. And it's valuing what the reviewer has said, but at the same time, it is ensuring that you don't need to act on unreasonable suggestions. And we'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by unreasonable suggestions in the next slide. I think the important point here for you to bear in mind when you're revising and resubmitting is to be able to strike a balance between giving in to what the reviewers and the editors want, but also holding your ground. And I think that this takes time to develop this idea of striking this balance. When I was an early career researcher, I was prone to giving in almost entirely. I would see a recommendation that didn't make sense to me, and I would just do it because I felt like I had to, and that if I didn't, the paper would get rejected. And yeah, on occasion, it's possible that there may be some reviewer who's very obstinate about making sure that everything that is suggested is acted upon and actioned. But for the most part, I find reviewers are more reasonable than you might assume. And I think that there is definitely the case for holding your ground on occasion. But again, when you hold your ground and say thanks but no thanks, do it in a way that's palatable. By the same token, giving in is an important skill as well. It's difficult for us, I think, as authors to give in when we didn't want to write it like that, right? If we wanted to write the paper the way the reviewer is suggesting, we would have written the paper that way in the first place. I know that's a difficult thing to do sometimes, to recognize that maybe there's a different way, potentially even a better way than the way that you've done it. And it's important to be able to let go, right? If you respond to reviewers saying with everything they're suggesting, thanks, but no thanks, your paper's not going to go through, right? If you just say, none of this makes sense and I refuse to do it, your paper will get rejected. That's just the way it is. But at the same time, you don't have to do everything. So I said we'd talk a bit more about this concept of unreasonableness. Your question might be, you're reading through your review and you're thinking to yourself, what if the reviewer, or even worse, the editor's comments are unreasonable? And I would ask you to reflect a bit on what that word means. What does it mean if a comment or a suggestion is unreasonable? And the reason I ask you to reflect on what that word means is that when I think about my career as an academic, from an early career academic to, I guess, in my late career, I don't know how I would describe me, an older academic, maybe, my definition of what I perceive to be unreasonable has evolved quite dramatically, right? When I first started as an academic, as an early career researcher, almost everything I read appeared to me unreasonable. I still made the changes, but I was often doing so in a disgruntled manner. I was making those changes against my will. And I don't know what it is about being an early career researcher. Maybe it's just you need to be rejected and pushed around and beat up a little bit before you can kind of come around to the fact that maybe the issue isn't so much them, the reviewers. Maybe the issue is you, the author. And I am increasingly, as I move into the later stages of my career, looking at my younger self and saying, no, maybe I was the one being unreasonable at the time. Maybe my perception of what they suggested as being unreasonable was wrong. So now when I look through paper reviews that I receive, I have a much less antagonistic response to them. I read through reviews and I think, yeah, well, come to think of it, that does make sense. Maybe it's not my preferred way of moving forward with the paper, but as long as it makes sense, I'm happy to make the changes. But remember, when you reject a suggestion, make sure that you try to put a positive spin on that, right, as we've already discussed. Okay. Next point, make it easy for the reviewers and for the editors, right? In your author's note, in your response letter, be specific. So I've given you an example here of the kind of language that you could use. Rather than saying, yep, I made this change, or done, or no problem, show them exactly where you made the change, right? So that they can follow up on this if they want to. Thank you very much. I made this change, as you can see, on page 5, paragraph 2, lines 34 through 41. Then the reviewer can go to page 5, paragraph 2, lines 34 to 31, and see for himself or herself that the changes have indeed been made, right? You don't want to make it difficult for the reviewer and for the editor to see how you've made the changes have occurred. All right. I actually had a case as a paper I was handling as an editor where the paper got a revise and resubmit, and the authors resubmitted the paper, but they didn't include any author's note at all. And there weren't any indications of which changes were made, which suggestions were taken up, which suggestions were not taken up. It was simply down to the reviewer and the editor to reread the paper, maybe reread the first draft of the paper first, and then reread the second draft to decide whether or not to accept the paper, because otherwise we had no idea what changes had been done. And I'm sure you can imagine what the result was after that round of revise and resubmit. It was rejected. And it was rejected because the authors did not make it easy for the editors and the reviewers to evaluate the extent of change in the paper. I recommend using yellow highlights to indicate new text against the previous draft. So when you resubmit a paper after revise and resubmit, any new text should be highlighted in yellow so that when the reviewer is reading through, we can see what has changed, what is additional compared to the previous iteration. I would avoid track changes. I think yellow highlights makes more sense. Track changes does get a bit messy. The simplified form is probably not too bad, but then the simplified form really isn't that different from yellow highlights anyway. The full form of track changes, where you sort of cross through lines and paragraphs, I wouldn't bother with that. For me, I hate trying to figure out and read through with all those different markings across the page. And in addition, you need to be careful based on the fact that track changes can sometimes have your name, listed because it's your version of Microsoft Word. And of course, that would make your paper no longer anonymous. So, key point to take away, make it easy. If you're not making it easy, you are damaging your chances of success. Just a few other reflections before I wrap up. I sort of thought about, okay, I've covered quite a few issues here in terms of how to handle a revise and resubmit, but there are a few sort of straggling issues that I wanted to raise. First one, if you need extra words, ask the editor first. Don't assume that this will be the case. I have found, again, as an editor and an author, that journals are more flexible these days than they used to be. And the reason they're more flexible is that we don't have paper copies anymore, right? The reason we had word limitations in the first place is that journals were paper copies and paper copies costed money. And so the publishers rigorously reinforced, typically an 8,000 word limit for a paper. These days, we have a bit more flexibility. I think, maybe you can get away with around 10,000 words for a paper in the field of management. But don't ever assume that to be the case, because at the same time, editors aren't going to accept papers that are 20,000 words. I mean, you're almost getting to the point of a monograph, at that stage. So if you do feel like you need extra word limitation to be added, then ask the editor first. Don't just assume it, because it would be a shame to do all that work and then have the paper unsubmitted for you to make those cuts. Next point, proofread your manuscript and the author's note and the response letter. Right? You know how it looks sloppy when you read a paper and there are misspellings and poor punctuation. That's true. You definitely don't want to have that in your manuscript. But I think a lot of people don't realize that when the author's note looks sloppy, that can also work against you, right? If there's all sorts of mistakes and spelling errors and poor formatting or whatever, that can actually damage your chances of success in peer review. So it doesn't take that much before you hit submit. Hit the spell check and make sure everything's in order. Give it one good read through from top to bottom before you submit, because sloppiness in either the manuscript or the author's note is no good. Ignore citation suggestions at your own peril. Again, I find this to be one of the sillier aspects of being an academic. We generally know, we can't be 100% sure, but we generally know when we receive a review from someone that says, well, this is an interesting paper, but you've totally failed to cite, Timming 2001, Timming 2002, Timming 2019, Timming 2015. It's pretty clear that Timming is probably the author of this review. Again, we can't say for sure, but we can make a safe guess. And as sad as it seems, and it seems a bit like kind of game playing or whatever, but let's face it, this is the world in which we operate. If someone is suggesting to cite a paper or a set of papers, you might want to try and incorporate those, because it does stroke the ego of the reviewer, and that's certainly not going to hurt your chances. Don't assume an extension will be granted. Maybe one extension, possibly 2 extensions. That's unusual unless you have pretty strong mitigating circumstances. But even one extension is sometimes not granted. And then you end up just wasting the entire 4 months that you've been given, and your paper gets unsubmitted. So that's why I always encourage people to start your revise and resubmits straight out of the gate, within a week, rather than waiting until the last minute and then hoping that you get an extension, because it may or may not be granted. Don't just assume that it will. Make sure your author's note and response letter is anonymized. This is a really important one, because managing editors will go through manuscripts to make sure that it's anonymized, but the reading of the response letter on the part of the journal's production team is considerably less careful. And if you in some way identify yourself in your author's note or response letter, that will automatically draw the process to an end, right? You have to resubmit to another journal. So make sure that you're anonymized there as well. Express your thanks at the beginning, at the end, and throughout. I think you can go overboard on this, right? I've seen two extreme expressions of thanks, but at the same time, you can go underboard as well, right? I've seen just, all right, done, 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 without any recognition of the voluntary time and effort that editors and reviewers put into the process. Okay, how long is too long to wait for a decision? I would say that the average time for a review these days is typically around 3 to 4 months, but in my experience, this appears to be getting longer. Don't please automatically blame the editor. I often get, not often, on occasion, I get emails saying, why are you taking so long? It's oftentimes not me as the editor, it's oftentimes the reviewers, and we're simply waiting for the reviewers to come in. So please be understanding if the time that you're waiting for your revise and resubmit decision or potentially rejection decision is beyond 3 months. My advice is if it gets to 6 months or even a year, maybe send a polite follow-up to the editor, just asking how things are traveling with the paper. I have a manuscript that took over a year to get the decision of revise and resubmit. We revised and resubmitted, and now it's been over a year for the second round, and I think it's probably about time that I write and ask how things are traveling. Should I ever appeal a decision? My advice is never to become a serial appealer, because you will develop a reputation for being a serial appealer, and that won't help. My advice is never send an angry letter to an editor. Right? I spoke to a friend who is part of a team, submitted a paper to Academy of Management Journal, got a desk reject, and one member of the team, on behalf of everyone else, without anyone else having a chance to see that email, sent an angry letter to the editor, and then my friend had to respond behind the scenes and say, that wasn't me, I've never agreed with that. So please don't think that I had signed my name to that. I would say you can appeal if there are procedural anomalies in the process, but as with appeals, when we teach, if it's simply based on I disagree with that decision, it's not going to go anywhere. Okay. How many rounds of revise and resubmit can I expect? I personally have had 5 rounds of revise and resubmit. I've heard of 7 or 8 rounds happening, maybe potentially even more. But what I would say is don't give up, because it's rare, not impossible, but it's rare for a paper to be rejected after the second round, right? If you actually get into the system, I would say after round 1, typically speaking, you have a 50-50 chance. When you get to round 2, 3, 4, your chances of success go up dramatically. So definitely worth the time to stick to it and don't give up. Okay, this is the end of my presentation on how to revise and resubmit your paper. We do have a few minutes left if you have any questions that you would like to ask, or any comments, or especially if you disagree with anything that I've said. I'm more than happy to engage with you. But thank you very much for your time, and I hope that that was helpful to you. Any comments?
Yes, thanks heaps, Andrew. That was really, really helpful. Thank you.
No worries. No worries.
Yeah, thanks. That was terrific. The last time I made through an R&R, I just put it in the chat. We were working with a group of editors, and got the paper where they wanted it, and then the editorial board of the journal pretty much canned the whole special issue except for 2 papers that got through. It was just I was like gobsmacked. We were so pissed off.
Yes. Yes.
But that's not normal.
Well, fair is not a word I would use to describe peer review.
Yeah.
I think we all know that.
Yeah.
And I see this in social media as well. The best comments don't always rise to the top. Sometimes the worst ones rise to the top. And in academia, I would definitely say the best papers don't always make it through peer review for whatever reason. It's the nature of the beast. Any comments, any disagreements with anything that I've said?
Andrew, I would just add one suggestion, and that is anybody early in career that isn't yet reviewing for journals, you should start, because I learned the most about how to write and how to understand editor letters and reviewer letters by reviewing. Because when you review for a journal and the editor makes a decision, you then get a copy of the letter of decision and all of the reviews on that same paper you reviewed. So you can see if you picked up on things that other people picked up on, or if other people picked up on things you missed. It really helps with your writing if you're reviewing.
Yes. No, I couldn't agree more. When I think back to my first role in an editorial board, this was Work, Employment, and Society. It was a real paradigm shift comparing my writing before to after. And the reason is that I spent so much time critiquing other people's writing that I started to critique my own as I was writing. And it definitely does help. Yes. Great advice. Prue.
I've started trying to think about reviewers as being part of the team. So, and it's a social process. The review process is a social process. And so I've once given ground way too much, and ultimately it didn't work because someone wanted me to write a different paper, basically. And I don't think reviewers should help you write the best paper that you intended to write about the topic you intended to write. Not actually just try and make you write the paper they want or prefer to write. But I think I find it's a bit of a balance. I treat them as though they're part of my team now. And in the response letter, I even have like that tone to my when I respond to reviewers, oh, thanks for that. Look, we gave it a go. And we've been able to implement it partially. So I talk to them like they're on a team. And I think it also takes the heat out of like being really annoyed with unreasonable folk, and we all get them. But anyway, that's kind of my approach, and I think it helps me mentally as well.
Yes, I think that's really important insight that you've brought, and I think it goes back to what I said in the presentation about putting a positive spin on the process, because in many ways what you're doing, like what you're doing and what you just described, is a lot like cognitive behavioral therapy. Like you're taking unhelpful thoughts that you have about a particular process and you're replacing them with a more helpful, cooperative and understanding way of moving forward, and it helps you be in a better mindset throughout the process rather than feeling like you're engaged with a bunch of opponents who are trying to drag you down. You feel like you're cooperating and collaborating with them and trying to, yes, work together to create this beautiful piece of research. So I think that's excellent advice, Prue.
I had a friend who also used to translate all of the reviewers' comments into a more constructive form. So she would retain the essence of their suggestion, but she would remove the division out of people's comments and reframe it quite nicely. And then she would she would only look at the nice version and get to work. So she felt like she had a friend helping her. Anyway, I thought it was an interesting approach. But
Yes.
Thanks heaps for the session.
No, very good. Any other comments? Anything that I missed? Personal anecdotes, horror stories, successes? Have to have been a few successes.
I have an odd story to share.
Let's hear it.
To this day, I don't know how this happened, but the last paper I worked on, and the editor had been very kind because I had not been at work for like 6 months, basically. And we just kept getting extension after extension after extension. And it was for a healthcare journal, and there were so many changes that they wanted us to make. That basically, like, your idea about the highlighted versus tracking changes, I don't know which would have been better, because everything in there was nothing not underlined in the paper, and it tripled in size, and they had no word limit, and they were just like, yep. And so it was a bit of a rush in the end, because the timeframes keep getting held up, and by the time I was back at work, I just had so much work to do on it. So I was really looking forward to hopefully a second R&R. I was really hoping for a second R&R, because there are a few things I wanted to tidy up. And we heard back from the editor about maybe 2 months after submitting it, and they gave us zero feedback from any reviewer or from them, and they just said accepted. And it was actually a really ungratifying experience in a way. Like, I was like, oh, I guess that's good, but
you know what's even worse is that the acceptance email wasn't even written by the editors. There are templates that we use.
Button. I know they've hit a button, accept, and yes, I don't know what happened there, but maybe we just beat them into submission through all of those changes. It was really odd.
That is an odd one, because it's a happy story, but at the same time, there's a bit of
It was ungratifying.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Good. Well, I think we are at the end of the session. Can I thank everyone for joining? Even Ash in the last few minutes.
Sorry, guys. I just finished another meeting, so I have to jump in to say at least hi. Apologies.
Well, we recorded it, Ash, so you'll be able to watch it post-hoc. But it went well. So thanks, everyone, for attending, and I wish you happy journeys with your next revise and resubmit.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you.
Yep. No worries. Bye, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
See you.